Hey everyone, welcome to this really quick presentation on how to write effective conclusions. So, if I was to ask you, what do you normally do in conclusion? Many of you will say, I'll summarize my thesis statement and all my points, right? So, that would be the most common answer. But doing a summary or restating the thesis statement and supporting points is not enough to create a really strong conclusion. So, why are conclusions so important anyway? They're essentially the last impression, the last word of your paper. It's your last chance to show the reader why what you've just discussed is important or significant, and it's a way for you to prompt the reader to maybe gain a new perspective on what you just talked about. The conclusion is also the way that we connect what we've discussed to bigger things, the bigger picture, right? Because things that we write are not just confined to the course and to that document, right? So, whatever topic you choose to write about, whether it's for a narrative essay or an argumentative essay, how does that topic and what you just discussed, how does that connect to the real world? And of course, conclusions reflect one of the most important goals that we have in writing. It's to influence the reader in a positive way or to enrich their lives in some way. So, what do conclusions do? Well, they do more than simply restating what's been said before, right? The conclusion can really impact the overall experience of your paper. So, let's say you have a very rushed and underdeveloped conclusion, maybe the reader might feel like a sense of it's lacking completeness, right? So with the introduction served as a bridge from your world, the world of your paper, to the reader's world, right? But what the conclusion does is it helps the reader understand why what you talked about is important and how it connects to their own life and to the rest of the world. So conclusions have three basic components. The first part is the synthesis. This is probably what you think about when you think of conclusions and having a summary of what you've written, right? But instead of a summary, think of it more as a synthesis. So now you're pooling your things all together, all your main points, all the things you've discussed, right? And you're presenting them in a new way or restating it in a different way. And the most important part of a conclusion is the so what. So you have to ask yourself at the end of your paper, okay, I just talked about all these things, but so what? Who cares? Right? And the answer to that question is what you want to have in your conclusion. And of course, you always want to end the paper with a strong final statement. So the first component, synthesis. So include that brief summary of the paper's main points, but don't simply repeat things, using different wording. Instead, show your reader how these things all come together, right? So here I have a great example from a former student, and it is part of the conclusion from a definition essay. So in the definition essay, they defined the term lover, right? And instead of defining it in the usual way people think of lover, like in the romantic sense, they talked about how they were a lover of art, they were a lover of science, they loved their friends, and they went into detail about those things. So now this is from the conclusion. So, one who is enamored, a person in love, is the original definition of lover. This concept is related to romance, but I've found warmth in all my quality of life aspects. Due to past experiences, I had believed lover to be a purely romantic term. I'd understood that such a label is something I would never be, let alone a term that might describe me. So here, instead of just summarizing, oh, a lover is not just this and it's that and that and that, they instead presented in a totally new way and pulled things together. But it still serves as kind of a summary of what they had already discussed in the body. So what? After you do the synthesis, so what? Right? You need to ask yourself, okay, why should anyone care about what I've just written about? Right? So maybe it looks like this. Maybe you explain why your argument or your stance matters, right? Or maybe you can clarify why you chose to have this opinion and why it's worth paying attention to. Or maybe you could talk about who would be impacted, right, by the things that you discussed. Or what are some consequences of the topic you discussed? So here's another great example from another student's conclusion answering the so what question. So this is also from a definition essay in which they talked about how their friends define them, their acquaintances, their family. And so we get to the end. So what? Right? Why should anyone, like especially the reader, why should we care about what they just talked about? So here the way they've answered it, right, basically is that yes, we are constantly being defined by others around us, but we shouldn't take all those opinions to heart all the time. We can't let other people's opinions take over our lives. And that's how they chose to answer the so what question, right? So basically, so what? Why was what you talked about important? Well, it was important because we can't let these other people's perspectives of us, right, control how we live our life. And for everyone's paper, the so what question, the answer to it, it's going to be different. The answer to the so what question could also look like other things. So, for example, let's say you, in the argumentative essay, you had an opinion about a certain issue. So, you get to the end of your paper, maybe you will offer a solution or alternative to that issue that you talked about, right? Or maybe you can talk about some predictions you have or possible outcomes based on the issue you talked about. Or maybe you explain the consequences, right, of that issue. Or maybe you ask questions for the reader and others who read your paper to really think about, okay, where else can we go from here? Now that this person's talked about this thing, right, where else can we take it? Or maybe you discuss how what you've talked about connects to something, right, to our island, right, island community, or to the nation, or even on a global level. So the so what question really, when it comes down to it, it's kind of like your final thoughts, right? Just think about, okay, why should anyone care? And of course, the last component is the final statement. Try to avoid ending your conclusion with, or ending your essay with a kind of like a cliffhanger, right? Where it kind of sounded like you were going to go somewhere else, but you didn't, right? You want to give a sense of closure to the reader. So maybe you can, your final statement could be like some kind of meaningful insight or reflection you have about the topic. Maybe when, if you do your argumentative essay and you choose to use sources, maybe it's a really strong quote that you found, right? Or it's a statement that leaves the reader thinking, right? Or it's a call to action, right? A call to action is something where you're encouraging the reader to do something, or maybe asking them to think about something in a different way. So here's an example from that same definition essay, in defining the term lover. Although I'm not a lover in the romantic sense, I see that I've always been a lover, a person that commits to acts with care, passion, and fondness, as there is nothing I put my time into that is devoid of love. And for this essay, that was a really great way to close it, give a sense of closure to the reader. And here are conclusions that are ineffective, and I'm guilty of committing many of these, right? But I hope you don't, right? Don't make the mistakes that I made, right, in the past. So the first type of ineffective conclusion is the that's it, pants it conclusion, right? You're like, you restate the thesis, the main points, and that's it. You're like, that's it, I'm done, right? Or the gotcha conclusion. This one is very frustrating for readers. This is when the writer saves the thesis statement for the very end at the conclusion, right? It's like maybe they were trying to build suspense or make it seem mysterious or to pull some kind of gotcha on the reader. This is very frustrating for the reader because right away we don't want to read 2, 3, 4, 5 pages to figure out what direction is this writer going in, right? It's not a mystery novel, right? It's an essay, so don't do this to your readers, right? The other type of ineffective conclusion is that we got this Guam conclusion. So this is when you end your conclusion with a final statement that's very dramatic, overly sentimental, or it calls for action in sort of this insincere way, right? So these types of endings can sometimes throw your readers off because, especially if you've provided such a strong, detailed, well-supported argument, right? It just doesn't match with the rest of your essay. So just be genuine in what you write. You don't have to be like, yes, we got this, right? The other type of ineffective conclusion is the I ran out of gas conclusion. This is what I've committed many times. By the time I get to the conclusion, I've run out of gas, I'm very tired, I have no more energy, right? So I just repeat the thesis statement and points, and I I zoom through the conclusion all the way to the final statement with no development, no transitions. And the last type of ineffective conclusion is the fiesta plate conclusion. Imagine you go to a fiesta or party, and they have either the foam plate or the paper plate, and imagine just piling on everything, right? All the wet food, things that have like sauces, plus all the rice, and then the heavy meat. That plate's gonna break. So the conclusion is the same way. You don't want to fit all the things you didn't get to talk about in the conclusion, right? You don't need to introduce new details, new evidence, new reasons, right? You're just doing the synthesis, the so what, and the final statement. So here are some tips and things to just keep in mind when you do a conclusion. So remember, avoid simply repeating the thesis statement and your points, right? Even if you change the wording or sentence structure, the summary is different. The paraphrase and summary is different from a synthesis. Do not change your thesis statement or argument or stance in the conclusion. And sometimes I see that, right? And that happens, right? Um, you wrote your whole paper and then you realize, actually my thesis statement, I was trying to say something else all along. In that case, change your thesis statement to reflect the rest of the essay. Never change the whole essay to reflect the thesis statement, because then you've just done a whole bunch of work for nothing, right? So avoid changing your thesis statement when you get to the end of the essay. And again, you don't need to bring up new supporting arguments or points. And also, you can avoid using phrases like in conclusion, in summary, finally. The reason I say this is that sometimes it depends, but sometimes it's very redundant because the reader already knows, okay, it's the last paragraph, the argument is coming to a close. And lastly, don't apologize for your views or arguments. And sometimes I do see that, right? And I used to do that too before, where I'd get to the end and maybe I had a really well developed, strong essay with a very well supported argument. But when I get to the end, I'm like, okay, well, if people don't agree with me, that's okay too, right? You don't have to apologize for the opinion that you had, especially if you spent all this time offering a really sound argument and a strong paper, right? So you don't need to be rude or brash about your opinion, but you also don't need to apologize for the argument that you did have. So I hope this kind of helps, right? Just a quick little video on how to write effective conclusions.